So there's a big ransomware attack on hospital chain in the United States, apparently a very big one, over 400 locations. And they have not really released much information about it, but people seem to be deducing from what little is out there that they probably got hit by ransomware. That would be the most likely thing. And so I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more about this. They recently said that the first person died from ransomware because of a hospital attack, where that person died because they were unable to move them to another facility in time, or something like that. This is whether you kill people with cyber attacks is difficult to prove. It's not as simple as like a gun shooting somebody. It's the same thing with water pollution and with economic policies that throw people into poverty. You can't exactly prove that killed this particular one person, but in statistics, you can argue that it contributed to a certain number of deaths. So these people think a third wave is coming. I certainly would expect it, because all the red states and Trump are working very hard to spread the virus, and Trump is now deliberately working hard to spread the virus, with Atlas telling him the best thing to do is spread it more, and that's the right way to deal with it. So we see the beginning of a third wave here, which was always expected by comparison with 2018. So that's why I'm expecting to stay offline for the next year. I'm expecting to stay out of face-to-face classes for the next year, personally, because I think this is going to get big, much bigger peak, bigger than we've ever had in the winter. And there'll be no progress at all on containing it until we get a new president, if we do. Anyway, so Midwest now has 25% positive test rates. Now, the World Health Organization tells you that you have to get the test rate down to 5% before you can open up, which I don't really understand. It seems to me like that number is kind of meaningless if you don't have enough tests, which has always been the case in the United States. If you only test people with symptoms, then the test rate will be very high. I think what they're talking about is the test rate. Well, I don't know. Anyway, that's what they're doing. But anyway, they do take this as a measure of how bad the spread is. In New York City, they're very glad that they got the test rate down to 1%, the positive rate, and it's 25%. So that's certainly a lot worse, I guess. It's always more complicated than it might be to compare states, but that sounds like a pretty big difference. And these are the states that are refusing to do anything about it. So here's another way to actually get somewhere. Now they're saying that you can sue your employers if your employers, like people at a meat packing plant, force people to work with no protection right next to other people when you know they're going to get it, which the meat plants absolutely did, and then they come home and get their house members infected, who then die or get sick. So this is very much like the secondhand smoke lawsuits. And so we will see what comes of it all. It's this may be a way to move forward, because the federal government appears to be, and all the red states seem to be determined to just absolutely pretend there's no problem here at all. But this is the American solution. If you can actually sue people and make them pay a lot of money, then you get their attention, even if they would rather pretend the problem doesn't exist. So this may be a way to provoke people to actually do something. So I was surprised by this. This is one of the, if you do an exercise, isn't employee liability one of the off the table? Well, I imagine it is, yes. Well, that's one of then that's why one of the reasons why there's never been the second wave of coronavirus payments from the government, because the Republicans say they must free all employers from liability so they can force people to work and not do anything when they get sick. And the Democrats aren't willing to do that. And that's part of one of the many reasons why there has been no second wave of checks. But yeah, absolutely. Anyway, so this group, the app called Strava, is apparently one of these things that keeps track of your workouts. A lot of these people have apps keeping track of how many steps they make and how many miles they run and stuff. And apparently, all along, this has been selling your data to make money by default, saying they're going to sell it to people. And anyway, they're claiming that this will be used by cities to decide how many more bus routes and how many new bike trails to install in towns and stuff. But Americans with some experience here, I think, know that once people get their hands on this kind of data, before long you're sorry that they're just selling it all over the place. But apparently they're doing it all along. So Windows subsystem for Linux runs Linux on top of Windows, and Microsoft has been getting more and more friendly to open sourcing some of their products. And the Windows subsystem for Linux has been greatly improving. And so now, of course, one of the open source advocates is saying, we'll just get rid of Windows entirely and run Linux on everything, and Windows should just be a subsystem on top of Linux. Now, I haven't heard anybody from Microsoft suggest this, and I very much doubt this. Some other people in my Twitter timeline say, this is a great idea, it'll be great, it'll work. And I think this is what open source people think because they don't understand Windows. If you actually study Windows and get some Windows certifications, you will discover that Windows has a really large number of big, complicated features that really matter, like domain controllers, cross-forest trust, Active Directory, group policy, and there is no analog for that in the open source world. So I highly doubt that Microsoft is ready to abandon Windows, but we will see. Anyway, they certainly are supporting Linux more than they used to, but it doesn't replace Windows in a corporate environment, not by a long shot. It's just a specialized alternative for certain special cases. So, as I mentioned, the Los Angeles Police Department has repeatedly said they're not using facial recognition to identify suspects, but they totally are. I think we all know that the cops and the law enforcement agencies lie through their teeth about everything. They plant evidence, they murder suspects. You know, their misbehavior comes up very clearly. They beat people, they cover up their cameras, they refuse to release the footage and just delete it. You know, all these, anything that can happen will happen, of course, and you have to have controls to stop all these things. So anyway, they've certainly has come out that they are using these videos. The facial recognition, a lot of major tech companies have in the last month or so said they're not going to produce any more facial recognition stuff because they've seen all the lawsuits, I think, that are coming. The facial recognition technology is not accurate enough yet to identify a suspect, and people that use it for that are going to get in a world of trouble. And the companies that provide it are probably going to get in a world of trouble. So IBM has canceled their program developing that stuff, and everybody's trying to distance themselves from it. So the relationship between Trump and Fox News is very troubling and very interesting. I mean, there's a small group of people at Fox News that actually want to create honest news. And then there's a bunch of huge evening commentary shows that are just 100% saying whatever Trump wants them to say, no matter how much it's a lie. And they're extremely popular and they make most of the money for the company. And so anyway, they have a person who will predict the election. And of course, what everyone expects to happen is that Trump will have a majority in some of the swing states on the day of the election, and he will then declare victory and say that all the mail-in ballots are fake. And it would help him a lot if Fox News would just declare him the winner quickly. So there can be great pressure to just declare him the winner on Fox News, and after that he'll say that settles everything, it's all over, and then send Barr to impound all the remaining ballots and say nothing more can be counted, it's all over. And so apparently there's a guy named Mr. Mishkin who is a real numbers guy and not apparently subject to political pressure. And they talk about this person, there's Mr. Mishkin, and he runs the prediction desk, and he claims that nobody can tell him what to do. And even if President Trump calls the CEO of Fox on election night and says, you have to declare me the winner, Mishkin won't do it. So at least he's portrayed here as a sort of incorruptible guy like Fauci is widely perceived to be an incorruptible guy on the virus. So even though Trump is absolutely pressuring people into lying about the virus, Fauci is the most trusted person who most people believe would not obey orders to lie. And when he says that a vaccine is safe or that you should do this or that about the virus, you're getting the unvarnished scientific truth. So anyway, we'll see what happens. So these guys have a spray that you spray in your nose to prevent the coronavirus. This actually, I've seen a few people talk about this. This sounds kind of promising. You put something in there that will hopefully stop the coronavirus from settling in your nose, and then this might protect you better than a mask or in addition to a mask. And they've shown that it works on ferrets, which is a far cry from humans, but they're trying to get approval for human trials and so on. So I don't know if it'll be able to make it through the approval process quick enough to do any good, but it does sound pretty promising. And so TikTok, Trump wanted to ban it last night, but a judge has temporarily blocked the ban, so you can still download TikTok. Haven't heard about WeChat. Maybe WeChat is actually banned, I'm not sure. TikTok and WeChat were both going to be banned. Actually, WeChat seems more important to me because it really matters for Chinese Americans communicating with their friends back home and sending money back home, whereas TikTok is probably worth a lot of money, but I don't think it really ruins your life if you can't get on TikTok, whereas WeChat is really important. But anyway, for the moment, it's blocked. I certainly don't, by the way, think that Trump has any legal basis to block either of them. I think if they really get this to court, they might have a pretty good chance of reversing those bans. Anyway, so this is something I've heard about, but I haven't seen the actual form before. Most of the big tech companies get a ton of law enforcement requests for data, Amazon and everybody. And what a lot of them do is they just have some web form that the cops can just sign on to get the data. But what I didn't know is that a lot of them just make that web form open to the whole web. They don't have to log into a VPN or anything first. So you can just, apparently it's, at least you could just browse right to the portal, which the cops use to request data from Amazon. And it looks like just pretty much what it should be. What's going on here? All right, non-emergency request. You have a case title, legal demand, case information, and then someplace I think you're supposed to now you upload a file, which is supposed to be the court order. And then they can just paperlessly decide if it looks good and approve you to get the data. What I heard years ago when China hacked Google in 2010, what I read at the time was that they just gave law enforcement a password to just take whatever they wanted from a server. But maybe there was some form like this involved. Anyway, all right, so let's get to the official class material. There's just one more thing I want to say here. There is a guest coming next Monday, a week from today. So I'll adjust the schedule to cancel the lecture that day. Stephen Booth, so please come to this. He'd like to see a lot of people here. He is the Cso of Fireeye. Fireeye is the company very closely related to this class and 126. Fireeye bought Mandiant, and Mandiant wrote the textbook for both of these classes and developed the techniques for both of these classes. So it's very, very relevant that he's here, and we should hear what he has to say. It's worth extra credit to anyone who tunes in. All right. So let's pick up with the slides, which I should have open someplace. Here we go. All right. So what we got today is the classic forensic duplication technique. This is the classic computer forensics activity that's been known for many years, and it is one of the things you might do in instant response. As we've talked about many times, it's not the first thing you do because it's kind of laborious and expensive, but this is where you copy all the data off a system. Instead of running some kind of script that just harvests the indicators of compromise and running processes and files and registry keys and some small group of data like that, you just copy everything, a whole folder, a whole file, or just the whole disk itself. Now, if you want to get the deleted files, you have to copy every bit off the physical volume. Deleted files are no longer in the directory of files, so if you go through a list of directories and download all those files, you're only getting what's called active data. To get the data that's deleted, you have to get all the in-between sectors that are no longer connected to any directory entry, and that you do with a duplication of the physical storage medium. So that's what's required here. To get a forensic copy, you have to be able to access every bit of accessible data and make a forensic duplicate. And therefore, you must, one of the things you must handle is read errors, because often some part of a hard drive or SSD has an error, and you have to not just stop at that point, but do something intelligent, like retry a certain number of times and make some kind of record that has happened. So you must, a big issue here is you should not change the evidence data while you're making a copy of it. If you just plug it into a computer, the computer will immediately start changing things on it, like the time date stamp and the trash can and the log that's kept to roll back activities that fail. There's a bunch of things that are changed, and that's not acceptable, so you use a hardware write blocker or a software write blocker that prevents any changes in the evidence drop. And you must make logs, so you can record what you've done. So there are some bits on the storage medium that you cannot get to. They are not intended for any user data to get stored. There, for example, the firmware that actually runs the hard drive itself is stored on the hard drive in an area called the host protected area. And so some forensic tools, like the old one that I don't think exists anymore, there's a Windows-based forensic tool that actually had the advertising it could collect from the host protected area. And they said, I thought this would make that tool desirable, but it turned out that there were very few actual cases of crime where there was anything important on the host protected area. You could, in principle, store data on a host protected area. I reverse engineered a game back in the days of the Commodore 64 in like the 70s that did this. on floppy disks. But anyway, it's typically not included in forensic images because in practice, it doesn't seem to be worth the bother to get it. So once you get a forensic image, you got a copy, and there are various ways to do it. The complete disk is where you copy all the addressable areas on the entire physical volume. A partition is where you get some region of the volume that is assigned a label like C, D, or E in Windows. And you can have logical acquisition where you just get the live data that fits some criterion, like being owned by a certain user or in a folder, in a home folder of a user or something like that. So a disk image works like this. You have a boot sector, which has been around forever. The first 512 bytes on the disk, if you're using the older disk format. And then you have a partition, which has to do with the original equipment manufacturer, often used for booting purposes. And then you have possible partitions. If you have a Windows machine, typically the whole thing is just one big partition called C, but sometimes you break it into C and D, and on Linux, sometimes you break it up into 4 pieces. So you have these various partitions, and those are contiguous blocks of data on the disk, but not the whole disk. And then you can have logical images, which are actually probably scattered all over the disk, not next to each other. They're just a group of files connected by something like all in a parent folder. And that's a illusion. If you see a bunch of files in a folder, like your home folder or your My Documents folder, they look like they're all in the same place to you, but there's no reason to think they're physically connected next to each other on the drive at all. They could just be anywhere. They're just connected by a pointer back to that folder. All right. And so if you look at HXD, you can open a direct link to a partition. And that's what I did here on just drive C. And if you open up you can open a partition called C, or you can open up the hard disk itself in HXD on a Windows machine, and you will see NTFS here starting the partition table. And then if you go to the start of the entire volume, you'll see another NTFS. This is the partition C shown there. This is the actual hard drive. Enterprise, yes. I'm glad you brought that up, Zui. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, Xuew, Shu perhaps. Yes, not only enterprise SSDs, but now large magnetic hard drives have an issue where they have extra regions to store data that are not included in the addressable range. And when it detects a drive error, it silently replaces it with another. Yes. And so the result is what I'm saying oversimplifies the situation quite a bit. So if you go back to this, if you were to consider old magnetic hard drives 500 gigabytes or less in size, then this was at that time literally true. If you bought a 500 gig hard drive, it had 500 gigs of addressable memory space here, grounded from 0 up to some large number, and you could copy them all. That was, yeah. Now but nowadays, because of disk errors, if you buy a 1 or 2 terabyte hard drive, it has extra sectors that are not mapped. And it will silently decide that a sector is bad and replace it with one of these. And when you go back to sector 10,000, your computer will not know that it's in fact looking at a different physical space on the hard drive. So you cannot really ever make a complete image of the full hard drive. And by the way, you can never erase the full hard drive. Sectors that have been marked bad still contain some data, and you can never reach them again. So it is more complicated. All you can really see are virtual sectors unless you hack the firmware. And Raymond says it's for wear leveling. Well, it might be, but I think the main issue is bad sectors. But on both SSDs and hard drives, this is currently the issue, that in fact, all the computer knows is a virtual file system, a virtual set of segments. So, however, nobody, as far as I know, pays any attention to that or cares. They just pretend that it's the way it was and carry on. Because another fun fact about forensics, of course, and for that matter, incident response, is you do not really need to have all the data. All you need is to find enough data to answer your questions and move forward. So you accept approximations as long as they're reasonably successful. I also think it is not common knowledge that there are extra segments in magnetic hard drives. I just learned that from personal communication or hearing a talk from Travis Goodspeed, and I'm not sure it ever got written up anywhere. But yeah, anyway, so in Ftk Imager, one of the common imaging tools on Windows, you can just choose the whole physical drive and it'll give you every bit on the drive, subject to, of course, the complexity I just described, or you can make other choices. And then you can put it in various images. A DD is just a flat file image. So if you have a 1 terabyte hard drive, it's going to make one file 1 terabyte in size. These other techniques break it up into files and try to compress it, but it's exactly the same data. So if the data is hidden because they've deleted files or partitions, reformatted, reinstalled, then the data you want is in the deleted files. And you have to get a whole drive image or at least a whole partition image if you want to have any chance of recovering that data. All right, so the host protected area and the data device configuration overlay are typically not available. You will not get them with most forensic tools. And in principle, malware could hide there, or even something horrible like kiddie porn could in principle be hidden there. But most people just don't bother to collect it because it's too much bother and not important enough. It is a thing to be aware of, though. In principle, there could be something there, and you need a special tool to get it. So active data I talked about, these are folders that have a name and an owner, and they're in the directory and they're currently in use. Unallocated space is the leftover space that is not currently used on the drive. So in a brand new drive, they're just empty, but in a drive that's been around for a while, they have fragments of deleted files. And then there's even smaller fragments in file slack. In the unallocated space, you might find complete files because a file might be 10 or 20 blocks of data, and you might just have a gap that has the entire file there. A file slack is things that are less than 512 bytes of data left at the end of a file because, or could be more, your block size on a Windows machine is typically 4 kilobytes. So if you store a file, it stores integers of units of 4 kilobytes. So if the last one doesn't fill the last block of 4 kilobytes, there will be some extra bytes left over at the end. So a small fragment of a file might be there. It's not going to be a complete file at all. So it's not of enormous importance, but if it was a text document, you might be able to read some of the text there. If you're really lucky, you might find something like a password or something. That's called file slack. All right, so partition image is what you might do if you have a disk partitioned into several drives. You could image just drive C, but not drive D. It's very much like a full drive image, but you only get what's on one partition. There's not often that you would want to do that. It would be sort of hard to understand why you would do that. If you are authorized to get all the data off the drive, you just get it all. If you're not authorized to get all the data off the drive, you'd probably get a logical acquisition of just the data that fulfills your requirements. It's funny to think of a situation where you'd want a partition, but no more. Now, a logical image is what you do if, for example, you're on a shared volume on a server, and it's shared by many people, and you only have legal authorization to get the stuff from one user. This is a quite common situation. And then you have to just settle for active data. I can only get current files that are owned by this user. I can't be grabbing all the unallocated space and finding fragments of files when I have no idea who owns them. That's not okay. This is very much like the situation with the blanket surveillance of the FBI in the United States, where they just get everything off the internet, everything off the phone network, and then they try to say, later on, we'll just look at the stuff we're allowed to look at, but we're going to collect it all. And that is something that most forensic investigators do not do. Only the government does that. Now, of course, if you are at a company on company hardware, then the company has the right to examine everything on the company hardware. So in that case, they could do it because anything on that hardware is theirs. But if it's your personal laptop or your Google account or something, that is probably not true. All right, and so, like I say, commonly you have a court order and it only allows you to get certain files, like only one user's file. And of course, if you have a business critical storage area network running and you want to get evidence off it, you don't want to take it down to image it, and you don't want all the data on it because it's monstrous. So you'd probably just do a logical image of the active data, and that's probably all you want. All right, so when you do it, you should save creation times, record of whatever authorization you had to do this, and save it with some kind of hash value so that if you make future copies of it, you can verify that hash to make sure the copies are exact. Commonly, people use an MD5 hash. If you want to be more mathematically pure, you might use a SHA-256 hash, but both of them are perfectly fine. They will protect against errors made in the copying process. In principle, an MD5 hash could be covered by forgery, but it's sort of expensive and complicated, and most people don't worry about it. All right, so there's also data you get that does not come from this standard procedure. You get a USB stick full of logs, you get paper printout, virtual machine files, PCAPs. You know, this is just like any investigation, you will get evidence, and whatever you get, you take and record, and you might use it. There's no particular reason why you can only use this one sanitary method of gathering evidence. Any kind of evidence is evidence of a sort. Somebody tells you something, you record it, and it may be useful in court, even if it didn't get acquired with a standard forensic tool. I've mentioned before, there are cops that have just picked up a cell phone and taken photographs of the screen while they page through the text messages. That's evidence. It's not perfect or complete evidence, but it is evidence. All right, so the hashes are there to make sure that the data is not modified and that the copies are accurate. If you have drives with bad sectors, then each time you read it, they'll give a different answer, and therefore you cannot get a stable hash. Most of your forensic tools will like to image the whole drive and then go back and make another copy and hash it to make sure the hash works. And that would be nice, but if there are errors, you're not going to get the same hash value every time, and that's just something to accept and record and keep going. So here's some formats. Access data is FTK. Its native format is this thing called Advanced Forensic Framework, but most people use the Expert Witness format, a very old tool that's not used anymore called Expert Witness to find this format, and Encase became the standard using it. And both of these store MD1 and SHA-1 hashes immediately, automatically, and they break your image up into a group of files that are 2 gigabytes or smaller and give it a whole series of names so they can be copied on fat 32 volumes that can only have 2 gig files, that sort of thing. So it's the old tradition for a long time, and they're compressed. So if you image a 500 gig hard drive, the total size of all these files is a lot less, unless that drive was really full of data. So a DD is just a simple point-by-point copy. So a 500 gig drive indicates a 500 gig DD drive file. This is not very convenient, hard to store, hard to copy, hard to move around. Open source tools often like to see it this way because it's very easy for the software to run it, but most commercial tools prefer these compressed formats that are much easier to handle. DD, if you copy with just the DD tool to duplicate a drive, then you'll just get a one-to-one copy and there won't be any hash or anything. So the military made some tools and donated them to the world. There are tools like DCFLDB that will compute a hash also. It copies it and stores another file with a hash value in it, so you can verify the integrity of your copy. Anyway, whenever you do create evidence which might go to court, you want to keep a hash with it so you can verify that it's accurate, and when you make copies, it's accurate, because of course, when you go to court, you have to send a copy of the evidence to the prosecution and a copy of the defense, and they both have to be able to verify that they got a 100% accurate copy. All right. So all these formats are mathematically identical. Just one is compressed and broken up into many little files. The other is just one big file. But if you take the compressed thing and decompress it, it should be exactly the same with the same hash value. Every bit should be the same. So it doesn't matter which one you use as long as you use it correctly. The only reason to choose it is convenience of handling, storage, and compatibility with whatever analysis software you're using. If you're using open source tools, you probably need a DD file. If you're using Encase or FTK, you probably want Expert Witness files or that AFF file. Anyway, and if you're going to do something really complicated, like take a series of physical images of a multi-drive array, and then try to zigzag your way through that mess to put it back together, then you'd probably want DD files, direct physical copies, but that's pretty exotic, and normally you'd leave that to experts. Anyway, let's take a look at the Cahoots. Chapter 8A is here. All right. it a few more seconds. I guess that's it. All right, the hidden part of a hard disk. That's the host protected area. All right. All right, which one will let you recover some files? A forensic image of a hard drive copies all the data, including the data that is not currently in use, which contains deleted files. All right, what kind of acquisition has the best chance of recovering deleted files? All right, the whole disk is the best thing. Then you have the highest chance. All right. All right, what kind of acquisition will ensure that you only get files owned by the suspect? Okay, that's a logical acquisition. All right. And what kind of image is most likely to be accepted in court? They're all the same. They're all mathematically identical images. There's no difference at all. It's like comparing an original file to a zipped version of the same file. They have exactly the same bits in there. So if you should be able to competently explain that in court as an expert witness, and there'll be no difference. All right. All right, what kind of image is easiest with open source tools? Okay, DD is what open source tools typically like. All right, so Raymond, all right, and LY, and BH, good. Those look like real names or initials. I think that'll do. All right, so let's do the next section here. All right, so duplication. This is the classic thing, a static image. You turn off the computer, you image just the hard drive, and now you're done. Typically, you take out the hard drive, you connect it to a drive duplicating machine, or you could, in principle, leave it where it is and boot from a special DVD for a special version of Linux that won't change the evidence. That will do the same thing with software. What most people do is they get these hardware drive write blockers. Take out the drive, you plug it in this write blocker like Tableau. This thing costs hundreds of dollars and is really pretty complicated because the computer at the other end wants to believe that it is writing to a journal and writing to the trash can. So this has RAM inside it where it pretends to make those changes, but it doesn't really change the drive. And that's the point. This is what all the pros use to image hard drives. Anyway, that's industry leaders. And of course, you need a device that can handle all the different connectors and cables like SATA and PATA and whatever else you've got, USB and so on. The alternative is get a special forensic drive image, drive DVD, like Deft had this, Kali had a version for a while, a forensic image, a forensic version of Linux. You boot from the CD and it prevents writing to any of the hard drives with software. So it has just removed all those features in the operating system that try to write on the drive. You can copy from the drive, that's the idea. But then you use a creation tool. You can use DD, or you can use one of the military versions of DD that makes the hash value, or use Ftk Imager or Ncase, or you can buy a hardware disk duplicator. A lot of companies buy these, not for forensics, but so they can deploy Windows machines. You have like 10,000 Windows desktops. You just have a special duplicator that can make many copies of a drive, bit for bit, so they can all have exactly identical hard drives. Anyway, so here's considerations. You have to have some kind of write protection, hardware or software, so that your source volume is not being altered. Otherwise, that is highly unprofessional. Make sure that your, if for some reason you cannot use a hardware write protection device, then make sure that your software is not going to try to write on that drive. Make sure you have something to store the data on that's big enough. And by the way, make sure you cleaned it off first so there's no other data on there. And consider if you're using a command line tool, make sure you know what you're doing, because it's very easy to get confused and copy backwards, which is why people like hardware write blockers. So even if you type in the command wrong, you cannot write on top of the evidence drive. So here's DD comes with every Linux distribution. It's there to copy data. But these are the ones from the Department of Defense that just add the missing features. They give you user feedback, and they create a hash value. So you can, all modern operating systems immediately write on a drive right away, because they're journaling, so they keep track of what's happening, so they can recover in case of a crash. And they change the trash can and timestamps and stuff. That's why you can't just plug a machine into something like a Mac or a Windows machine, and just because you don't copy a file onto the drive does not mean it's not being changed. I found this out the hard way. Years ago, I was teaching Windows XP desktop support in a shared machine with people who were teaching Server 2003. And when I upgraded my XP to Vista, their Server 2003 wouldn't boot anymore, because just booting Vista caused it to upgrade the journal to the next version incompatible with 2003. So I killed their partitions without ever doing anything that I thought was writing to them at all. That was how I learned this the hard way. Anyway, so Ncase is the tool used by most police departments, very expensive. A lot of corporations use it. So you can create images directly in Windows. It has command line utilities too. There's Linux-based boot disks out there too. And then there's live duplication, where instead of taking out the hard drive and just copying the hard drive offline, you copy a running machine while it's running. Now this is called a smear, because of course it takes time to copy all the files, and the files are changing. So you're not even getting a snapshot at one instant of time. Now that doesn't make it useless. It does mean that you cannot reproduce it and get the same hash value. Everything keeps changing. It's just like a live acquisition. You are measuring something that is changing, and you're measuring with tools that involve running some software on the machine. So you are in fact changing it somewhat yourself. So it is an imperfect acquisition, but this is what you often do. If you have a business critical system you can't turn off, or if your drive is encrypted and you have to boot it up to decrypt it, then there's no real option, no practical option except to do it this way, unless you have some kind of offline decryption tool you actually trust. So all you can do is a live acquisition. And now in the world of instant response, we've all gotten used to doing these live acquisitions. Like we talked about live response before, where you don't even collect all the data. You just send your machine a query and you get what you asked for. And now you have something that's evidence. It's not complete or perfect evidence, but it does usually move you towards your goal. You find out what matters. So here's the risk. You have no write blocker. You are changing things. You might slow it down or crash it. So you should avoid installing anything on the system or trusting anything on the system. You should be running an imager from some other source, like a read-only network share that we talked about last time. Be aware of this. And another thing you may face is funny hardware, like a MacBook Air is just sort of an enclosed case. It's hard to open. The components are hard to remove. So rather than figuring out how to take it apart and getting special tools and expertise, you might just boot it into target disk mode, and then it acts like a portable disk drive, and you can image it like a portable disk drive, and you can connect an external write blocker. There's also a special, I think Deft, that's why I used to use Deft when I taught this kind of forensics. Deft has the ability to image MacBook Airs. But you know, it's in practice, I just used live acquisition when I had to examine. Anyway, then you have these complicated multi-drive arrays, which are huge and complex, and you typically, it's such a drag to image them. You really have to ask yourself, do I really have to image this? It's like last time we were talking about imaging an entire running database. Say, do you really want all that data? Probably you don't. Probably if you think about what you're trying to do, you can have a more careful question to get a more reasonable amount of data. In principle, you can copy the whole thing, but it's quite a drag. Anyway, and virtual machines, of course, almost everything is now a virtual machine. All the servers you use are. Many people are using them on desktops and so on. So if you have going to copy a virtual machine, then your life is very easy. You can just suspend the virtual machine, and then it puts everything in files. It puts all the RAM in a virtual RAM file. It puts all the hard drive in a bunch of virtual hard drive files. It does basically a forensic image right there. All you have to do is copy those files. It's really very inconvenient in this regard. I mean, makes your life very easy. You have basically a complete forensic image just right there anyway, because that's what it has to boot up with. So anyway, that's kind of handy. All right. So let's take a look at 8B. All right, I'll give it 10 more seconds. All right. So, software included in every Linux system. DD, disk duplicator, or I think it might have a different acronym, but just copies data from one drive to another, or one folder to another. All right. Free Windows software. The Ftk Imager. The analyzer is expensive, but the imager they make free, because in reality, you often send a relatively untrained person to go to a scene to collect the evidence. And then you bring it back and the expert can, more highly trained people analyze it. But collecting the evidence is kind of a dull job, and you just train people pretty easily to use one of these imagers. Anyway. All right. One allows you to collect a valid forensic image just by copying a few files. Virtual machines, they basically work from a forensic image anyway. They have an image of the hard drive, an image of the RAM, just sitting there in files. All right, which one is particularly helpful on Macs? Target disk mode. All right. All right, K10, XC, and LY. So one twice, good. All right. I'm going to see the full name of XC in the log. I'll put it there. All right. Good. Well, I think I'll stop the video.